European. This is our country. We live here, we die here.
Defiant words from Saif al-Gaddafi, the son of the Libyan leader.
To those terrorists.
The rhetoric hasn't changed. The rebels are simply terrorists and the Libyan nation is united. It's a theme he further explores, saying that pro-Gaddafi demonstrators make up the vast majority of Libyans.
2 days ago, have you seen thousands of people marching the streets and the squares? You saw them early in the morning?
Yes.
This is the real picture of Libya.
But even when announcing the return of captured Dutch soldiers, he allows himself a slight smile, a sign perhaps that confidence is high in the government camp.
So we captured the first NATO soldiers. We're sending them back home, but we're still keeping their helicopter, the armed helicopter.
On the ground, though, it's a confused picture. The tiny town of Bin Javid has seen fierce fighting and no real picture of who's winning. The jets still fly overhead as talk on whether to enforce a no-fly zone dominates the international agenda. Perhaps, though, Gaddafi's last words are his most telling.
Libya is not a piece of cake. We are not a Mickey Mouse.
Fighting words indeed. Imran Khan, AlJazeera.
Well, let's talk now to Anita McNaught, who's in the Libyan capital, Tripoli, for us. Anita, a series of EU, Arab League, African Union meetings are set to be held. As that diplomatic process goes on, how are government authorities there reading the pulse of the international community?
I think they're ignoring it, Sami, and doing what they want to do. Look, I think the only thing they were worried about was that the international community would take some kind of concerted and tangible action early on in the peace. And I think as they've watched here, the international community dither about what it can and should do and look at each other for a mandate to take action. The Libyan government has decided it has more room to move than it might have first earlier thought and has carried on steadily escalating the force it uses and upping the collateral damage in the process.
At the same time, we're seeing some changes going on in the military situation on the ground. Are the rebels now losing momentum?
I think the rebels always had an uphill battle. Many untrained, recently acquired military equipment borrowed from Gaddafi's own army supplies. You know, in many respects, one of the things that Tripoli needed to do only was wait for the rebels to tire themselves out. They don't have properly established supply lines. They don't have the backing of army brigades behind them. They have a huge desert area to move across and a lot of ground to cover. By the time they got anywhere near a position to threaten Tripoli, they would inevitably be exhausted. So the push for these very inexperienced fighters was a huge challenge, whether Gaddafi's forces bombarded them from the air or not.
Yesterday, of course, we saw Libyan officials flying around different capitals, particularly in Europe. How much of a blow is it to the Libyan diplomatic offensive that representatives of the rebels are now being recognized in some places like Paris?
Well, I think they find it insulting and offensive, for sure, but they don't find it in any sense credible. And their tack has been to carry on with their version of events, which is that they have a small, malevolent uprising within their own territory. They've said very clearly it's not a matter for the international community. This is a problem within our own country. The way they've characterized it, it's an al-Qaeda-inspired uprising that people have jumped on board with. They don't recognize that it has a civilian inspiration anymore. They're not called protesters. In fact, I was asked yesterday when I met the foreign minister for a long interview what I called these people. He said, do you call them protesters? Because they're absolutely determined not to confer any legitimacy on the people protesting against the government now. They are militia. They are armed militia, notwithstanding the fact that the people who may have fired the first shots were government forces back in mid-February.
All right, Anita McNaught, live for us there from the Libyan capital. Let's bring you some breaking news now on that diplomatic front. Foreign ministers from the Gulf Arab nations meeting in Saudi Arabia have issued a statement saying the Libyan regime has lost its legitimacy. Well, the AFP news agency is reporting that the GCC, or Gulf Cooperation Council, will try to establish links to the Libyan Opposition Council. That's, of course, based in Benghazi. Just to recap for you there, officials of the GCC releasing a statement calling the Libyan regime of Muammar al-Gaddafi illegitimate. For more diplomatic moves from Europe now, let's get the latest on that from Felicity Barr at our London Broadcast Centre. Felicity.
Sammy, thanks for that. Yes, the French president earlier welcomed a delegation from Libya's Opposition National Council, and Paris now says it will only deal with that alternative government in Libya. President Sarkozy's government has also severed ties with Muammar Gaddafi's regime. Tim Friend has the latest from Paris.
After being accused of being slow to react to the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, the French president has moved quickly to silence his critics and take the lead in reprisals against Colonel Gaddafi. Meeting representatives of the rebels at the Elysee Palace, he promised them immediate diplomatic recognition.
France has expressed its satisfaction about the creation of the Libyan National Transition Council. And after this meeting with President Sarkozy, I can say that France has recognized the Transitional National Council as the legitimate representation of the Libyan people.
The French plan is reported to include proposing limited airstrikes against key Gaddafi targets, such as his headquarters and a military airbase. There was no official confirmation from President Sarkozy's office, and it's a highly controversial proposal that would meet with strong resistance from many European allies, who are also wary of giving the rebel representatives diplomatic recognition at this stage.
That's a decision by a single government. I think it's better for us to listen to the stance of the entire European community.
The Elysee Palace says that Mr. Sarkozy is seeking legal authority to prevent the use of force by Gaddafi. It believes that jamming his communications would be a good start. Tim Friend, AlJazeera, Paris.
Well, in the past few minutes, the British Prime Minister David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy have issued a statement to President Van Rompuy proposing 2 steps. They are to stop further suffering of the Libyan people. Muammar Gaddafi and his clique should leave. They went on to say, we support the efforts of the Libyan Transitional National Council to prepare for representative and accountable government. Well, our correspondent Alan Fisher joins us live now from Brussels. And Alan, just underline for us what else was in this quite long, lengthy letter that was sent to Van Rompuy.
Well, this is clearly what Nicolas Sarkozy and David Cameron are planning to present to the European Council, the leaders of the EU countries who meet in Brussels here in a few hours' time on Friday morning. And this is what they hope will form the basis of any agreement coming out of the 27 countries. They say that there is an unacceptable continuation of violence and repression in Libya, and while calling for the removal of Muammar Gaddafi, they recognise the legitimacy of the Transition Council. So they are also saying there should be an end of force from Muammar Gaddafi, that they should continue to monitor the humanitarian situation, and that all countries should implement immediately an arms embargo on Libya while stepping up humanitarian efforts to help those who have been victims of the violence and also